Hi there, this is Dave Litton, and a warm welcome to you on my PMBOK PMP Integrated Change Control video. And in this video, I intend to demystify and to teach you the exact way that you should be using change control when preparing for your PMP exam. After you've watched this video, by all means, hop on over to my website www.pm-primer.com and get your hands on the very best video-based PMP preparation course on the planet. So let's get stuck into integrated change control. And first of all, I want to give you an overview picture, if you will. You're probably familiar with the general process sequence, where you have the initiating process group that sets up the start of the project by creating the project charter and identifying key stakeholders. That brings you to the planning process group, where in essence you create the project management plan. You then proceed to execute the project, which basically means giving out the work packages and creating the products. And while doing so, you'll be in parallel using the monitoring and controlling process group. Monitoring the project is comparing progress against the approved baselines contained within the project management plan, and controlling the project is taking some form of corrective action whenever necessary to keep the project on track. And then finally you come to the closing process group, and here you'll be wanting to close down the project or the phase, and if you have any, to close procurements. Now, the idea of this process model is that it either tracks the course from the very beginning of the project to the end of it, or it repeats this for each phase or stage within your project. But the focus of this particular video is on the process Perform Integrated Change Control, where you'll be using the change control tools, using expert judgment, and using typically meetings as the main tools and techniques. But where confusion occurs is that this general process sequence is in fact iterative. Yes, you plan the project at the beginning, but as you go through the project, you'll want to update the plans and, with appropriate authority, update the baselines as well. You'll be continuously monitoring the project throughout, comparing the progress to plan, and then taking corrective action. Many times, those corrective actions will need to go back and replan the project. So the iterative loop here is because changes can both be caused by and or affect these particular processes. In fact, there's three, since as you know, monitoring and controlling the project forms one process group. But I wanted to break them out here so it's clear they are in effect two main courses of action. And it's this cyclic approach which can often confuse you in terms of how to apply this correctly according to the PMBOK guide. So first of all, let's set the scene by saying, why change control? Why do you need it? Well, I'm sure you already have a pretty good understanding of the fact that without change control, you're very likely to succumb to what is known generally as scope creep, where if you don't have a process for managing and controlling change, then the project scope is likely to gradually creep, usually wider and deeper, causing delays, cost overruns, and worse, late delivery of the project end product. And this, of course, is where Perform Integrated Change Control at a macro level, because it forms part of the integration knowledge area, comes into its own. So here's some good reasons why it needs to be there. It's there to ensure that change control is managed in a structured manner. Also, to maintain the integrity of the project's baselines. Those are the baselines contained within the project management plan. If the project baselines are allowed to get out of control, then you won't know what you're comparing progress against. It's there to ensure that there's prompt review and analysis of any corrective and or preventative actions, and I shall clarify both these shortly. It gives a prompt review and analysis of change requests. Prompt is important because any delay in progressing change requests can be catastrophic. And by the way, in case it isn't obvious, change control within the PMBOK guide is not there to prevent changes, but rather to ensure that changes are only implemented once they have been properly reviewed, options checked, and the appropriate authority given for them to proceed. Every time a change request is approved, then the project baseline elements will also need to be updated to reflect that change. By using change control, you're able to incorporate approved changes into the project management plan and other documents. And while I'm mentioning other documents, if you've studied the PMBOK guide, then you'll know that there is often an input called project documents. And these can be any documentation that either the project produces or ones that influence the project. These might be standards that you need to follow, or agreements that have been set up, or documented procedures. Another reason why you should be using change control is so that changes are coordinated and managed across the project. Now this is important because a change in one area may have an impact in others. A simple example I like to give is that if you were designing a new car, and as partway through that design, run as a project, it was agreed to change the size of the tyres that you were going to fit to the car. Well, just thinking it through, if you change the size of the tyres, you may have to change the size of the wheel arch within the chassis. You may have to modify the suspension. Because of different sized tyres, you may have to change the ratio of the gears, and so on and so forth. So that's why this process is called integrated change control, so that changes are indeed coordinated and managed across the whole of the project. Another reason is that all requested changes and their impacts are documented. People do tend to have selective memories when it comes to changes, and that what might seem a good idea on Monday, by Friday, once the full impact is understood, it may be too late to revert to the original configuration. Plus, of course, people get blamed for this. So the path from the original change request right the way through to when it is eventually approved, that audit trail must be documented. And the final good reason I'll mention here is that it will give you a holistic process for both managing and implementing approved changes. And you're about to see exactly how that occurs. First, a glimpse then at the project management plan. The reason I'm showing you this here, and it's not just simply to remind you that the project management plan is a single formal document that defines how the project is managed, executed and controlled. You've probably picked that up already. But in fact, it's a suite of different plans and baselines. You have three baselines here. The scope baseline, that's derived, if you remember, from the work breakdown structure. The cost baseline, and that isn't just the budget, it shows how the money is spent from the beginning to the end of the project. And of course the schedule baseline, usually typically shown as a Gantt chart. So in addition to those three baselines, you also have these 13 other plans, all that make up the project management plan. And although they're all called plans, you should see them as strategy documents as well. For example, the risk management plan will show you how you intend to approach the management of risk throughout your project. And I'm sure you can already start to see that if any changes are proposed, then as part of managing such changes, you would want to fully understand the impacts on any or all of these plans and baselines. So managing changes involves maintaining accurate and reliable measurement baselines, as shown here, and coordinating all processes impacted as a result of the change, as you're about to see. And this also includes revisiting the planning and executing processes where needed, and updating the project scope to reflect any changes in the product scope. As I've already said, a requested change in just one area of a project will almost certainly result in changes and therefore impacts in other parts of the project and the products that you're creating. It clearly lays down in the PMBOK guide that the project management plan is progressively elaborated. Put another way, it means it's created in the first place, then refined and revised and updated in a continuous manner throughout the project. And one of the main causes of it needing to be updated will be as a result of any proposed changes. And of course, the project management plan specifies the who, the what, the when, the where, and the how. Traditionally, the why, as in why are we doing this, is answered within the business case. Now, the creation of all of those parts of the project management plan doesn't just happen in one process. Indeed, the integration knowledge area within the planning process group has the single process called Develop Project Management Plan. And you might be mistaken in thinking that that is the one and only place it is created. In fact, within that particular process, the change management plan, configuration management plan, and the three baselines are created. But the rest of the plan, under the planning process group, is assembled in the other processes. And I've listed them here for your easy reference. Under the process plan scope management, that's where the scope management plan is created, along with the requirements management plan. I won't go through all these, as the intent of this slide is to remind you that the project management plan is in and of itself an iterative process just to get to the first time in the project where the project management plan is brought together and approved. So that if during executing or the monitoring and controlling process groups you need to return, it's these processes that you'd go to update as and when necessary the different parts of the project management plan. And before we get into the details of change control, it's important that you understand the part that configuration management plays here. Now, configuration control is managed through the configuration management system, which will have been applied to each particular project. It may well be that a configuration management system exists in your organization as a central department or group. But what this configuration management system does is that it is concerned with changes to the specifications of the deliverables and or the project management processes. You see, there's two things here. There's the configuration of the way in which the project is being managed, as well as the deliverables themselves. So just quickly looking at the main elements of configuration management. There's a step called configuration identification, and this describes the characteristics of each product, service or result of the project. You're familiar with the use of the work breakdown structure, and at the highest levels you have the different products, so that an end product may be a computer system or a car, for example, but it will consist of many sub-elements within it. These also are products, and the configuration of them is under control of configuration management. Configuration identification also verifies when changes are made and how they're managed. Think of a simple document as an example here. You would want to know exactly what version number it is that you are using and that you're using the correct or latest one. The other step within configuration management is something called configuration status accounting. No, it has nothing to do with accountants, but what it is, it documents and stores the configuration information needed in order to manage the product information. And the third major piece is configuration verification and auditing. And this determines whether the configuration item, let's say it's your wheel bearings of your car, is accurate and correct in order to ensure performance requirements have been met. It's an audit, after all. Sticking to configuration verification and auditing, this ensures that changes are properly assessed, approved, tracked and implemented correctly. And it's this last point that plays nicely into change control. Indeed, change control would be out of control without it. You see, configuration management includes the change management system, plus the process for going through what I've just told you. That is, requesting in the first place, tracking and determining whether change requests should be approved or otherwise. Configuration management identifies the physical characteristics of each product, service or result. It also controls changes to those characteristics and documents changes to verify that requirements were indeed met. These days, configuration management is often used within an organization as a standard application. Good. Well, there's a very swift overview of configuration management and why it's important, because of course it contains the change management system. So next, it is very important that you understand the big picture. Check this out. I've called this a change control overview, and you're familiar, I'm sure, with the executing process group and monitoring and controlling process group. And this graphic shows why most people can get confused about performing integrated change control. You'll see here it is indeed a cycle. Here's a snapshot of that first slide just to remind you the bigger picture. Now, having got the project plan approved in the first case, you would then go into the executing process group, and I've shown these in purple here. These are the processes, starting with the direct and manage project work. And it's this process that actually gives out the work packages and creates the products. Now, because the executing and monitoring and controlling processes work in parallel, I've shown them here in parallel. So here's the monitoring and controlling processes that you would also use. Monitoring and controlling, as I've said, it's there to monitor progress against the plan, and controlling is to take corrective action as and when needed. So let's suppose that at some point within this time here that a change is requested. What it needs to do is to be sent to the Perform Integrated Change Control process. This is in the Monitoring and Controlling process group. And don't worry, I'll explain what goes on in there shortly. But the output of this is either approved changes or rejected changes. So leaving the rejected ones aside for the moment, let's just look at the changes that have been approved. These then input back into the direct and manage project work, exactly the same process that was up here. And as you can see, one of the many inputs to direct and manage project work is any approved changes, in which case it is here that they will be implemented. However, that's not the whole story, as you can see. Let me show you. You see, one of the main outputs from direct and managed project work is the deliverables or products. But the journey hasn't finished yet, you see, because the deliverables are then sent to the control quality process. It's here that each deliverable is inspected, measured and tested to make sure, of course, that it meets the appropriate quality standards. And the output, therefore, from the control quality process are the verified deliverables, because of course they will have passed any inspections and have met quality standards. But before I show you the next step, it's probably worth reminding you about the difference between the process control quality and perform quality assurance. This one is in monitoring and control processes, and this is an executing process. Folks often get very confused about the two. Let me clear this up right now. You see, perform quality assurance is concerned with process improvement and not the actual deliverables themselves. It's only control quality where each deliverable is inspected, measured and tested. However, the journey isn't quite over. You see, the next thing that happens is that the verified deliverables are then input to the validate scope process. You can see how useful this diagram is. So what's validate scope all about? Well, unlike perform quality assurance, which is there to confirm correctness, validate scope, by way of contrast, is mainly concerned with the acceptance of the product by either the project manager, the project sponsor, the customer, or maybe other appropriate managers. So validate scope ensures that the product, service or result of the project matches the documented scope. And the main output from validate scope is the accepted deliverables. So now we've got that covered at the high level, and I hope you can see now the key processes that are involved. I've actually taken these steps and put them in one focused diagram. Here it is. So a change request is raised by just about anyone with an interest in the project, frankly, and this is input to the perform integrated change control process. The output from there is either that the change is rejected or, in the case of this diagram, it's approved. By the way, if it's rejected, then it may require more analysis, for example, looking at different options. But as I've said earlier, let's focus on any changes that have been approved. They then go into the direct and manage project work, which is where the work packages are given out and the products are created, and hence the deliverables are created. Once a deliverable is created, it is then passed to control quality, as I've shown, and the output of that is verified deliverables. It then inputs to the validate scope process, and the output is the accepted deliverables, either passed to operational use or carefully stored until the project is fully complete. Now, change control comes in three basic flavors, which I want to discuss. The first being preventative action. Now, we'll look at corrective action in a moment, which involves implemented actions to agree with actual deviations. In other words, they've already occurred. Whereas preventative action, this one, deals with anticipated or possible deviations from the performance baselines. What you're trying to do here is preempt potential future problems. So you'll be taking action to prevent the same problem from reoccurring. That could be an example of a preventative action. It might be changing a resource in order to improve skills and experience. Let's suppose that the team are taking longer than originally estimated to create certain products or to carry out activities. Enhancing the skills would be one way to go. Another way, of course, might be training team members to improve their skill set, if you've got time, of course, or it may be training team members to provide backup skills because, for example, the project manager knows that in the next phase, those particular skills will be needed. So that's called taking preventative action. It's anticipating possible future deviations and dealing with them now. If on your journey to work on the radio you hear that a certain motorway or freeway is heavily blocked, then you may detour off and go via a back road to get to your ultimate destination. That would be taking preventative action. So similar to corrective actions, preventive actions result in the creation of recommended change requests, which are either approved or rejected in the Perform Integrated Change Control process. So preventative actions are one type of potential change that needs to be input into Perform Integrated Change Control. And these are of course implemented during the direct and manage project work, which is actually where the work gets carried out and the products or deliverables created. Here's a quick snapshot. It's only meant as a reference for you right now. I won't talk through it in any particular detail because we'll be covering these later. But the typical processes where recommended preventative action would occur would be in monitor and control work, control quality, manage project team, and control risks. I'll talk through these in a little detail later. Next up, corrective action. Now, this is any action taken to bring the expected future performance in line with the project management plan. So, whereas preventative action is to prevent something bad from happening, this is merely adjusting your course on your voyage, so to speak, to bring it back on track. And it's something the project manager would do possibly very informally. However, many corrective actions need to be handled more formally. Now, good project management will ensure that projects must meet their performance measurement baselines. Do you remember the three? Scope, cost and schedule. And if you find you're drifting off from any of those, then the project manager must apply some form of corrective action. Similarly, the only way to make sure they meet those baselines is to constantly execute the work and monitor and control. Now, the recommended corrective actions are outputs typically of, for example, manage the project team. A corrective action might be that right now the team are not performing and you either need training or replacement. Don't get confused. When I covered preventative action, that was about a potential possible future need, not something that's happening right now. Monitor and control project work. This is where validated changes are input to, and as a result of looking at how the work is going, change requests can emanate from it, just the same as changes needed when managing the team. Perform quality assurance. This is looking at the processes. Again, you may find a certain process is not having the desired effect, in which case a change request may need to be raised. I've covered validate scope just now, and you'll remember it was to do with the acceptance of the product or service. Well, as a result, you may well find that some aspects of the deliverable concerned, there may need to be some changes made to it. So change requests can emanate here too. Control quality, this is where your approved change requests go into and the validated changes come out. And since this is where each deliverable is inspected, measured and tested, as a result of those two, you may have change requests. Even though the main purpose here is to validate the changes, that may not always occur. Control schedule, similar story here. As a result of needing changes to the schedule, a change request may need to be raised. A similar story in control costs. As a result of controlling or managing risks, there may be change requests there, potentially new risks that had not been identified earlier, or existing responses which weren't having the desired effect could result in a change request being raised. Remember, we're looking at corrective action here. We're talking about something that has happened now. And control scope. An example here may be that the customer has asked for something extra, in which case a change request will need to be raised. And control procurements. Now, control procurements are different in that this is the process where the buyer and the seller review the contract and, of course, the work results to make sure that the results do indeed meet the contract. And for that reason, any approved change requests need careful consideration by both the buyer and seller before they are formally incorporated into the contract itself. And for the usual reasons, as a result of controlling procurements, there may be a need to raise a change request. The third type of change is called defect repair, and this is very simple in that it's really rework, and it is necessary when a component or a deliverable of the project does not meet its specification. In other words, it's a defect and we need to fix it. So defect repair is discovered during the quality management process and is formed into a change request during the monitor and control project work process. Now, these changes are either approved or rejected in the Perform Integrated Change Control process. Let's see what those steps look like. Step 1. Let's suppose that a defect is found while measuring functionality. This could happen while monitoring and controlling the project work or via the process control quality. So the next step. This is a recommended defect repair and is a requested change coming from the monitor and control project work process. What happens next is the change request is input, as they all are, to the Perform Integrated Change Control process, where it's either approved or rejected. Assuming it is approved, then the defect is now repaired. However, the repair now needs to be validated to check that indeed the repair has brought the product back to specification, for example. So that defect repair typically occurs during monitor and control project work or indeed control quality. So let's now look at how those particular types of change fit into the Perform Integrated Change Control process itself. Now, combining the corrective action processes and the change processes in order to show how these merge into the Perform Integrated Change Control process. Defect repair and preventative actions are not shown here because they're similar to the other processes and could also result in a new version of the project management plan. So here we have corrective action processes, first of all to measure between actual performance and planned baseline performance, determining if there is a variance, and depending on that variance, is corrective action required. If it is, then we need to consider alternative actions and recommend which of those alternative options, if you will, to take. Other changes to consider here might be changes discovered during the project executing process group. That, of course, is where you're giving out the work and creating the products, or changes discovered during the project monitoring and control process group. These are all input to the Perform Integrated Change Control process. If approved, then you will want to update the project management plan, as this, of course, contains the baselines. And then you can proceed to manage against this new updated project management plan. You'd want to monitor and control the project against that new revised plan, and also to measure the effectiveness of these implemented corrective actions. So that's how the big picture fits together. Let's now look in a little more detail, just reminding you that whenever a change request is raised, it needs to be first approved before anything else happens, and then validated, as I've already described. Keep that in mind, and let's look at those processes again in a little more detail here. So, starting at the beginning of the integration knowledge area, you have the initiating process group, and here we are developing the project charter. It's the project charter that is then used as an input to develop the project management plan. This process, of course, is in the planning process group. The output from that is the project management plan itself, as I've already outlined. The next step then is to go ahead and create the products, and this is done via the Direct and Manage project work process. These are the typical inputs you have. Note you have approved change requests for any requests that have already been approved. And the main outputs, if you will, from the Direct and Manage project work, you have work performance information, you have updates to the project management plan, and update to other key documents. The main output here, however, are the deliverables themselves. Note also, as I outlined earlier, change requests could emanate here as a result of directing and managing the work. Now we're into monitor and control project work. The main purpose of this is to check the project progress and to make any corrections if required. I've already covered corrective actions in the previous slides. Notice here, as I've shown you, that validated changes are an input into monitor and control project work. I won't go into detail of the main inputs here, I've just included them for your information only. However, looking at the main outputs here and reminding yourself that change requests can be raised as a result of monitoring and controlling the work against the plans that I've already discussed. That brings us to managing the project scope, which is the purpose of the Perform Integrated Change Control process itself. Here is where all change requests are entered as an input, and the output from this are the approved change requests themselves. Note the use of a change log here to capture the history and status of all changes. The final process, which we're not too interested in for the purpose of this video, but to include it, is during the closing process group, the closing the project or phase. This is where the accepted deliverables are input, and the output of the closing project or phase is the final product, service or result is transited to its relevant customer or operational area. So let's now look at this in even more detail. There are, in fact, as you saw from that high-level view I showed you a few slides back, 4 basic change processes. So let's start here with the direct and manage project work. This is where the work packages are worked on, if you will, and work is started on creating the project deliverables. This indeed is where the products or deliverables get built. And for the same reasons, this is where most of the budget is spent. If you're building a new apartment block, then the cost of that is all incurred during this particular process. I've included other inputs, outputs, and tools and techniques for completeness, but I want you to focus here on the fact that it's here where the deliverables are created, but it's also as a result of directing and managing the work that change requests can emanate. That brings me to the Perform Integrated Change Control. Remember, I'm showing you these with a focus on change. So it's these change requests that are now input to Perform Integrated Change Control, where they are either rejected or they are approved. Again, the change log is used here to capture and manage those. And the next step is to perform quality control. And this is where the products are validated to ensure that they meet the quality standards. Note again the input here, approved change requests, comes in here to control quality where the changes are validated as I've described earlier. And in a similar way, as a result of attempting to validate the changes, new change requests may also be raised here. And guess what? Yes, they'll go back up into Perform Integrated Change Control, just like all change requests. The final piece here is the Monitor and Control project work. And the focus here is on managing the way that this project scope is executed. What this integration process does is compares the work results with the plan and adjusts the work or the plan via corrective action that I've covered earlier. Again, the focus I want you to have here is that the validated changes also go into monitor and control project work. And the purpose here is that when changes are approved and made, they also need to be brought back into the process of monitor and control project work to make sure they were executed and rolled out properly. So finally, I have 2 summary slides that brings together all of these ideas for change requests and the use of integrated change control. So starting with a high-level view of the process groups, I'm not going to cover the initiation process here, but start with the planning process. And to remind you that the process called plan procurement management, if indeed your project is procuring goods and services, then you can have change requests emanate from that particular process. And the reason is that sometimes changes do need to be made to the project in order that procurement can be properly facilitated. You may, for example, need to modify an existing product in such a way as to allow a subcontractor to use that product for their own contracted work. In such a case, like always, these change requests need to go back through the Perform Integrated Change Control process in order to evaluate their impact on the rest of the project, as I've suggested here. Now, looking at the executing process group, it's worthwhile noting that the scope, time, cost and risk do not have executing processes for fairly obvious reasons. Since you don't execute scope, it's merely set and agreed. And neither, for example, do you execute time. Time is merely used. So, that said, let's look at what is covered in the executing process group. Starting with the process we dealt with a lot already, that's the direct and manage project work. Here, change requests may be raised as a result of executing the work packages and creating the deliverables. You may well find that either the way in which the work was carried out or indeed the deliverables themselves may need changes. In the Perform Quality Assurance process, don't forget this is concerned with overall process improvement and not with checking the products. But however, as a result of checking the overall processes, change requests may be necessary, normally in the area of procedural changes. They too need to go into the Perform Integrated Change Control process to look at the impact of that on the rest of the project. When it comes to managing the project team, I've merely shown 2 processes here for completeness: the acquire the project team in the first place, because this is a process concerned with staffing the project in the first place, getting the right people involved to be assigned and to work on the project. However, one of the inputs to the managing project team process is the issue log, and I've deliberately not included here the develop project team process. Now, manage project team is where usually the project manager is actively managing each individual within the team to ensure that they perform according to the plan. There may be several situations arise here, such as some may leave the project for whatever reason, you may have conflict between one or more individuals, or for external reasons you may have low morale on the project. Whichever of these may occur, it's the project manager that will be working to resolve such issues. And as a result of that, change requests may need to be raised, most likely to change certain members of staff to make sure they work as a cohesive whole. If you're using procurements within your project, as a result of the process conduct procurements, very similar to planning them in the first place, sometimes changes to the project are needed in order to facilitate procurement. Remember that this process is where the bid package is issued to potential sellers, bidder conferences are held, and the evaluation of proposals are considered from potential sellers in order for you to select one of them. And as you might imagine, in carrying those activities out, it's highly likely that some form of change request may need to be raised. Which brings us to the process, manage stakeholder engagement. Now, what the project manager will be wanting to do here is to ensure that all the stakeholders are fully satisfied with the project and that it's leading to a successful conclusion. This will include making sure not only that they are indeed happy with the way the project is being conducted, but also that they are involved in an appropriate manner and that their voices are heard. So therefore it's equally quite likely that change requests can result from the very fact of stakeholders being informed about the project progress, and either that progress or the nature of them being informed needs to be changed. Final slide. Now looking at the monitoring and controlling process group on the whole of this slide. Again, reminding you that scope, time, cost and risk do not have executing processes. Hence, there will be no change requests. So starting at the top with monitor and control project work, you will recall I mentioned that validated changes are brought into here, and it's important that they need to be checked that they are indeed being executed and rolled out properly. And if they're not, then change requests via corrective actions may need to be raised. Perform integrated change control, which is the main input where all change requests are sent. And out of that process comes the approved change requests. These are then fed back, as you saw earlier, into direct and manage the project work. The change log is used here to help manage all changes. When it comes to validate scope, which is the process that checks that the product, service or result of the project does indeed match the documented scope. And it does this by comparing the plan with the results to see if there are any variances, and if so, to take any appropriate action. Next up, control scope. And the main purpose of this important process is to make sure that all change requests are processed appropriately, and also that the underlying root causes of scope change requests are fully understood and managed. An important aspect here is to make sure that not only scope change requests are managed, but also to prevent any unnecessary requests for scope change. Bringing us to the control schedule process, like all of the control processes, this compares the work results to the plan and to make sure they are both harmonised with each other. And if they're not, then this may cause a change request to be raised in order to carry out any corrective action. Bringing us to the control costs process, in a similar way to schedule, the costs are compared to what was originally planned within the cost baseline, with a focus on any variances and bringing them back into harmonisation. As a result of doing that, then similarly to control schedule, change requests may need to be raised. Still on monitoring controlling process group, control quality is up next. This process typically uses inspection to make sure that the results of the work are what was expected, so that it involves both product and project deliverables continuously throughout the project. As a result of doing that, change requests may indeed be raised. You'll recall from earlier slides that it is the control quality process that validates any approved change requests. So each deliverable is inspected, measured and tested. And as I've already explained, validated changes are the corrected defects, if you will. Control communications is used to obtain feedback from all communication activities, and as a result of that feedback, there may be a need for change requests. Similarly, the control risks process may need to raise change requests as a result from risk events occurring, and they don't occur exactly as one expected, or that a change is needed in a risk response, which almost certainly will need to update plans within the project management plan itself. Control procurements, if your project is using procurements, an input there is the approved change request, but they will need approval by both the buyer and the seller, and as a consequence of that, change requests may need to be raised. For example, as an ongoing response to reviewing the contract or contracts. Bringing us finally then to the control stakeholder engagement process. As a result of feedback, there may need to be changes to the way in which the stakeholders are kept engaged or informed or involved, if you will. This may result in the communication management plan needing to be changed. Good. Well, I do hope that has been helpful to you and that you've enjoyed my short video on integrated change control. And if you are currently wanting to pass your PMP exam and to do so at your first try, I strongly urge you to go over and take a look at my website www.pm-primer.com and check out my PMP mastery system for getting you through the exam at your first attempt. Don't forget, the Project Management Institute will award you 35 PDUs for carrying out my training. My name's Dave Litton, and it's been a pleasure taking you through this video on integrated change control, and I look forward to working with you soon within my PMP mastery system. So, bye for now.